Put yourself in the Zionist position. The Zionists, in the history of the creation of the Israeli state, were invaded by Arab nations when they first announced their state.
Yeah.
And then they had the 6-day war. And then they had the war over Sinai that took place as well. The Zionists believe that the armies of the Arab nations are anti-Zionist and that are committed to the destruction of Israel because they believe, rightly so, that Israel stole the land of the Palestinians, that it's colonizing the Palestinian lands. The conclusion of the Zionists after those wars was that the armies need to be dismantled. The Arab armies need to be restructured. They need to be dismantled. The reason I say this is that Biden pursues it from the framework of peace, that to achieve peace in the region, these armies need to be retrained and they need to be retold, which is why America spends a lot on the armies in terms of providing them military aid and the like, to retrain the armies into a way that lets them abandon those anti-Zionist tendencies in order to try to come up with a new army that is more amenable to integration. Why? Because these countries are not democracies. Yeah. These countries are ruled by military rule, and therefore if we can make sure the military are pro-Zionist, then therefore Israel will be able to be successfully integrated into the state. And as Robert Kennedy suggested, Israel is the US outpost through which the US is able to maintain a foothold in that jungle that is the Middle East. His words, not mine. The point being is that Biden justifies it from the idea of peace. That at the end of the day, Omar Bashir ruled for 30 years and it was considered a military dictatorship. Biden argues. I always say that Sudan sometimes is a bit more nuanced. Al-Bashir was able to bring in many parties into his government. I'm not saying he was ideal or perfect. I'm not saying there were free and fair elections. I'm saying that there was at least consensus governments on multiple occasions, to the extent that even Jibril Ibrahim from Darfur, a non-Arab who's now finance minister under this new government, Jibril Ibrahim, who was leading the forces that reached Durman in 2008, he led the forces from Darfur, almost took the capital Khartoum. Jibril Ibrahim himself entered into a government, him and Minim Nawi and all these other people, they entered the government of Omar Bashir afterwards, and they were able to establish a peace agreement with al-Bashir and enter his government and also to rule with al-Bashir itself. The point is that the US argues that in order to achieve peace, we need to restructure these armies, and while the process may be difficult and turbulent, it is a very necessary process in order to do so. And that's why, while he convenes these structures of democracy, Biden's definition of democracy is one in which much more leftist, anti-religion, one in which Islam does not dominate. And we saw that even in the Arab Spring, in that when the Islamists, they won, and I'm not saying the Islamists were the ideal representation of what Muslim politics looks like, but certainly when the people demonstrated an affinity for Muslim-leaning parties,
Tunisia, Egypt.
In the words of Macron in 2020 in the Le Grand Continent magazine, he said that when the Arab Spring elections took place, we realized that Arab populations have an affinity for regression. In other words, that they voted wrongly, basically. It shows that the Americans believe that in their democracy, there's no room for the Islamists, there's no room for these religious-leaning parties. And therefore, in their perspective, to pursue this democracy in Sudan, if that's what they're pursuing in Sudan, to pursue this democracy in Sudan requires these ideological changes to the state. But I think that in Sudan, more specifically, it's more to do with how do you integrate Israel into the region. The Iraqi army is now destroyed.
Yeah.
Assad is now out of, the Syrian army is now out of action as a result of Assad. I'm not saying it's as a result of Assad. You look at the Saudi Crown Prince, Vision 2030, moving away from all that. The Egyptian army is placid. It's not doing anything in terms of... And now you have the Sudan as well, where you have the ability now to reconstruct the army itself through Hemeti, who's supported by the UAE itself. So it's not about whether the US justifies it or not. It's that the US has very carefully constructed a sanctions campaign that had lasted for 30 years that is now bearing fruit from its perspective. And now it's trying to allow room through which it believes this turbulent process would lead to a transition period whereby they can socially engineer Sudanese society to abandon the role of Islam in politics and social life and accept a new form of secular civil rule that will help to contribute to the integration of Israel into the region in a way that the Sudanese were adamantly against before, to the extent that al-Bashir in 2019 even refused to allow an Israeli plane to cross over Sudanese airspace to go towards Kenya itself.